You're all very welcome to the Holywell DiverseCity Community Partnership Building. We're delighted that you're all here today. We're really delighted to be getting this conversation underway about land and natural resource ownership patterns. This is a conversation that we started, I think, over a year ago with our partners and Fermanagh Trust. And we're delighted that Carnegie Trust took the decision to support our pair of conferences. So, to set the context a wee bit, I think we all know that land and resource ownership is a really emotive subject. And given the historical context of this place, it's even more challenging, particularly given the legacy that centuries-old decisions continue to have here. But we want to make sure that this conference today and the discussions that will take place here is a safe space for some challenging conversations. This is a place where we can collectively air issues and feelings with a view of moving forward together. So why community ownership and why that focus? I think part of it is our own experience here in Holywell Trust and the wider DiverseCity Community Partnership is that ownership of resources has helped to transform the conversation that we have with the people that we work with and the people that partner with us as well. We see that whenever you own something, it seems like you've got a greater stake in the conversation, that people take you that wee bit more seriously. But apart from anything else, excuse me a second, it means that you have an asset that you can use, a starting point for the conversation. And we believe that what we're doing here as a collective of organisations needs replicated on a larger scale. And it's no coincidence that the partners in this project are two community trusts from the West. Our collective experience of need for community-led redevelopment, of doing it for ourselves, has come to the fore. We need to take responsibility for our own futures. We need ownership and responsibility for the stewardship of the resources to help move this place forward. So today's event, we want to help shape and start the conversation towards greater community ownership and responsibility. We're delighted to be joined by some local voices. We've got David today from the Rathlin Island Community Development Association, who'll give us the local picture. We also have expert input from Scotland on the experience of local communities, but also on the changed legal context and the realities of implementing this. And we'll also hear about the importance of proper management of land and resources to ensure that they're safeguarded for the future. And we'll have conversations in our small groups and creating the connections informally between us. So we hope they help shape and inform future conversations. As you can see around the room, there's a couple of cameras. So we're going to be recording the keynote addresses today because we have a lot of people that couldn't make it. But we're going to share this widely because we believe that this is the start of the conversation and we need to get this as wide as possible. And there will be a paired conversation and a paired conference in Fermanagh, but I need to have a chat to Laurie about the date. But we'll do that later on. But enough from me. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, David from Rathlin Island Community Development Association. Just bear with me 2 seconds as you hear it.
Thank you for the welcome, for those words, Stuart. It's a delight to be here. We've already had a feast on this topic last night, gathering with some of the other speakers that I'm looking forward to hearing more of today. I'm aware that I'm a fraud, really, and I didn't realise we were going to be videoed. Whatever you do, don't show that to anybody on Rathlin, because if I go off script, that's the end of my job. Rathlin is just a piece of Northern Ireland. In many ways, we're a place apart. So what you will hear in this next 2 hours as I go through these slides is, he laughs nervously, is only a fraction of what this picture is about. And in terms of land ownership and land management and community management, we're the fraud in the sense that the RDCA, the Rathlin Development and Community Association, owns nothing, has no, apart from a few computers and desks, but that's it. We own no land, we have no community assets other than a few that we've leased. So we're not even scratching the surface, we're just maybe whipping the tops off some of the weeds in what we're doing. Anyway, on with this. This first slide, my notes on this first slide just says hello. But the point of that is this is hello from me, from David, and not from Michael. You should have had the more bona fide voice from Rathlin here, the chair of the RDCA. Unfortunately, living on an island, he's also the skipper of one of the ferries, and he had to take it round to Killybegs the other day. So today, I think he's now trying to get it out into dry dock so we can have it back again, and people can find their way onto the island. So apologies from Michael that he's not here, and apologies that you end up with an English voice, which isn't even Northern Ireland, from Rathlin, and I don't live there. I'm the community development worker on the island, and I've worked there for 7 years, but my commute every day, I think, has to be one of the best in Northern Ireland. I go out on the ferry from Ballycastle and then back again in the evening. Do come and see us. Has anybody here not been to Rathlin yet? Keep your hand up if you're from Northern Ireland. Let's see. I do have a tourist brochure if you want to see one afterwards. Right, on with this. Where are we? Liam said we want the kind of Rathlin for dummies. None of you are dummies, but where are we? Well, there we are, look. But significant in this and in the gathering today, we are on the map for Northern Ireland, but we're also very firmly on the map for Scotland. We were contested, I gather, many, many years before I was born. But the importance of that is we've been in the Scotsman, the Herald, we've been on Scottish television since that Brexit vote, because if we're pushed, we'll go with Scotland and stay in Europe, or we'll go with the South and stay in Europe. But we have no doubts that Brexit was not doing Rathlin any favours. It's the only inhabited offshore island in Northern Ireland. Belongs to that old kingdom of Dalriada, when the sea was more of a bridge than a separation. And 4,500 years ago, Rathlin, before Europe, was trading with Europe, cutting out porcelainite, turning it into axe heads and arrowheads and various other bits and pieces which have been found across the spread of Europe. So a long time ago, the island was trading with its own natural resources. Population in the 1800s maybe was over 1,000. Probably in the 1990s it was down to around 75. It's now about 145, depending on who's counting. But the important thing is it's climbing again. There were 3 babies born to Rathlin Islanders this year. There were 5 a couple of years ago. The school's now growing. We have 10 children in it. That's a lot to do with the infrastructure improvements in recent years. It brings all kinds of opportunities. It also brings crisis, because we're now pushed to the very limit with housing. So a lot of panicky conversations going on with Housing Executive and with Apex, possibly, over the road there, to see what we can do about that. There's a connection for Derry for you. There was a bloke from Derry sailed across that sea bridge well, I don't suppose he came across in the Columkill, did he? But St Columba, on his way from Derry over to Iona, we reckon did a motorway stop on Rathlin's, helped spread the monastic movement across there. And of course, then the Vikings came in and raided the monasteries and various other things. We reckon that in 795, the first Vikings landed in Ireland on Rathlin. Or was it Scotland then? The land has been a cause for conflict, obviously, through all of those ages, whether that was the Vikings or the monasteries or whoever. And in 1746, Reverend John Gage bought Rathlin Island in its entirety from Lord Antrim for £1,750. I'm told that's about 350,000 today. It's still not very much, is it, for an entire island? Long story about the Gage family. Were they reforming landlords? Maybe. It depends on where you are in the picture, and it certainly depends where you are on Rathlin and what your memory of that is some will say positive things about those experiences and point to advantages like the mills being built, the kelp store being built, walls being built, etc., etc. Others have a very different interpretation of it. The Land Reform Act in Ireland and in Northern Ireland in the 1880s and then again into the 1920s changed the face of Rathlin for all time. We lost our laird, if you like. The community can no longer buy out the island. We now have, I don't know how many lairds. The land was sold off to the tenants, usually, I'm told, at rent prices. A lot of conversation in there that I can't even pretend to give you off the top of my head, but fascinating history in terms of how those various land acts in the 1880s and the 1920s were effective in Northern Ireland, or in the part that is now Northern Ireland. Who gained from it and who lost from it. We did both, I guess, depending on your perspective. In the mid-90s, early 90s, the conservationists, the environmental agents, began to discover more of Rathlin Island, and various legislations were laid down on the island, designated areas. The area that most of the island is now, well, all of the island, in fact, is an area of outstanding natural beauty, which means certain things can happen and other things can't, of course. It's also home to ASSI's, areas of special scientific interest, special protected areas, special areas of conservation, and a large area at the west end is a nature reserve. Shortly we're to add to that a marine conservation zone around the edges. And again, long story, but that could be a reason for conflict, as it has been. It is a reason for carrying baggage, because many of the landowners will experience that as a legislation that prohibits their activities or limits their activities. That translates into, I suppose, an interest in fencing land and putting up the no trespassing signs. We don't want, shall we say, we don't want officials walking across our land in case they discover a rare flower, and if they discover a rare flower then we won't be able to farm it as we have done. So rather than go down that road, we'll keep the fences there and we'll keep the signs up and we'll not talk to them. In some cases, those rare flowers or the rare birds, the choughs or the corncrakes, can also bring opportunities for grants and land management in different ways. So there are well, checks, literally, checks and balances, I suppose, on that. But it is a very delicate and conflictive subject. Whilst on the one hand it's a matter of conflict and diplomacy, it could also, and is for some, a great reason for pride in the island. Others will talk about the island as being this remarkable home for wildlife, an incredible experience of environmental preservation, conservation and opportunity. Some of those environmentalist organisations now that we work much more closely with now are looking at how the environment can be used to sustain the economy and to develop the economy. Rather than stopping something, it's about now seeing what we can make that do for us, how we can make it work. But it is always a very delicate dancing experience between those different perspectives of land uses. The farmers, the tourists, of which we have increasing numbers. We'll probably have some more after today, I hope. Environmental protectionists, environmental development. Relationships are always delicate. I could have put a slide in there of rats and ferrets and geese, I guess. That's symbolic in many ways of where we're at the moment. A little while ago, well, a few years ago, the RSPB came up with with a project, really, that they found funding for a feasibility study at least, to eradicate the rats and the ferrets from the island. There are rats galore. I don't see them very often, but I guess if I lived on the island it would be very different. There are ferrets too, and those ferrets, the ferrets and the rats, will lower the population of ground nesting birds. That's where the RSPB came into it. They'll also wipe out any chickens and ducks that the residents will try and keep themselves. So that's a constant struggle. It also means that feedstuffs are attacked by these creatures, and farmers are continually having to protect themselves from that. It means extra expense is incurred by farmers to fence themselves from the rats, and they'll trap and shoot the ferrets too. Geese get thrown into the pot because they migrate onto the island. They lived on the island. They now apparently eat more grass than a herd full of cows, but they can also be a cause of disease for the cattle, and farmers can lose cattle because of the geese. Rats and ferrets, very contentious issue. Can we get rid of them? Yes, but we're not sure as we want the RSPB to do it. Many people on the island, most of the people on the island would say, yes, let's do it, let's go with it, let's get rid of them no matter who's doing it, but some others would prefer not to. I don't think it's because they like rats and ferrets. It is about the old conflicts and delicacies between environmentalists and landowners, and we're still having to negotiate our way through all of that. One of the ways to try and do it is to throw the geese into the pot as well. If we can get rid of the geese or cull the geese, as we've seen on some of the Scottish islands, it may then buy us a little bit more leverage to do something with the rats and the ferrets, as long as we can do it ourselves. So again, yes, we can do it, but it has to be ours. It can't belong to an outside environmental agency. That little white stone building is the resource centre for the RDCA. We lease it from the council, and we lease that little, well actually we don't lease that little plot of grass there. We have an agreement from the council that we can do something with it, and at the moment the only thing we can do with it is to turn it into a meadow. And that slide's in there just to show you that that is the only bit of land that the RDCA has any say over on the island, and even that we don't lease. The rest of it, the rest of the work that we do with the landowners, with the agencies, with the government departments, with the tourists, is done by permission. And here's an example of a project that we did manage to do with permission, although we don't own any of the dry stone walls. A number of years ago there was a lot of the walls, for those who've been to Rathlin, you'll recognise a lot of those dry stone walls have been in need of attention for many years, but that one there in that top left corner, that's the before and after, if you like, that had just about gone. It was buried under vegetation, and it's the main strip that the visitors walk along in front of the pub, McQuaig's Bar. Very visible, very important. We asked questions about the dry stone walls. Could we have a project to run the dry stone walls? The popular version was no, you can't, because the farmers will never accept it. They won't allow anybody on their land, they wouldn't put any money into it, and you'll just never get them to agree. And so for a long time nothing happened, because that perception was taken as the truth, the end story of the matter. Eventually, Michael, when he became chair of the RDCA, said again, well, let's ask. Why don't we just ask? And he went round to the farmers whose walls would be in that bay area mostly, and said, if we were to do this, if we were to get a grant, if you were absolved of any insurance liabilities, what about the chances of doing up those dry stone walls? If we could run that as a project which would bring some employment to the island and bring a bit of training, and who knows, maybe someone who's trained can then do more dry stone walling afterwards. Every one of those farmers said, yeah, fine, no problem. Why has nobody asked us before? And so it happened, and we got money from Heritage Lottery, and for 9 months, I think, about 11 people, most of them islanders, not all, worked with a professional dry stone waller and managed to repair 1.5 kilometres of dry stone wall. That was a remarkable opportunity for a very visible project, which was very popular with tourists, who were forever stopping them and asking them what they were doing and how they were doing it, and could they have a go. but also with the islanders, because those walls were being built and islanders were employed in it. Again, it was an example, and a positive example in this case, of the RDCA playing the honest broker in the middle without owning anything, but managing to do that delicate balance and having something achieved. The issue of who walks on the land, who owns the land, and what permission you have to do what on it has always been there and will always be there, I'm sure. But like that dry stone wall project, there's a lot of perceptions which in many cases are not true. Who owns the land? Can you walk on it? Do we have right to roam as you do in Scotland? The answer is no, we don't. But can I walk on that farmer's land? Well, you might be able to if you're a certain kind of person, you might not if you're not. It will depend on what you're doing and how you're doing it and how many people are with you and what day of the week it is. So can we clarify some of that for everybody's sake? And what do you do with those tourists who come in and with the best will in the world want to walk around the island or want to walk across some of that farmland, don't know whether they have the permission and will fall foul of unwritten rules and perceptions? So we spoke with Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust and the council, and eventually funding was provided to do an access audit. A simple piece of research which took many months and a lot of very careful, sensitive approaches to farmers, to other landowners and to others to try and get some kind of picture of who owned what bits of land and what could be done with it. But the moment you ask someone, particularly you ask a landowner who owns the land, then the doors go in, the walls go up. Why do you want to know who owns my land? Why do you want to know who owns that bit? What's this about? Are you trying to take it away? Are you trying to say, and the suspicion is the default position. It had to be done very carefully and very delicately. So who owns the land now? The popular voice would say that we swapped the laird, the Gage family, for 3 landowners. Northern Ireland Environmental Agency, the RSPB and the National Trust, who are the big landowners. They have bought small pockets of land and added another pocket to it and added another. And there is a feeling from some people on the island that not only do they own all of the island, which of course isn't the truth, but what they don't own at the moment, they are looking to own. So we're heading down that road, is that popular feeling. Now, of course, if you look at that access audit, it's not quite that at all. The 3 of them put together own less than a third of the island. They are very significant swathes of land. I think there's about 3,500 acres on the island, and those 3 organisations, NIEA, RSPB and National Trust, own just under 1,000 acres between them. Do they have expectations of expansion? Well, maybe. It's not always clear, and it's not always easy to get those stories from any of those agencies. And whatever response we get from them isn't always believed. And so the dance continues. Oh, just to add another one to it, of course, we have all those areas of of historic interest. So the ground itself is saturated with Viking remains, Bronze Age remains. At the side of the pub, 10 years ago, as they started digging for the foundation or to clear land to build houses, they discovered 3 kists of Bronze Age burials and took away the body or the skeleton of a man who turns out to be about 4,000 years old. He was taken away unceremoniously in a small cardboard box that used to house crisps, and I believe he's now sitting on a shelf somewhere in a warehouse in Belfast. He's been studied extensively, and one day we'd hope to bring him back to the island. But that raises other questions about the land and how you own it and what part you have to play in it. Do we just bring him back and bury him where he was? Do we bring him back and bury him somewhere else? do you bring him back and put him on display? And you can't. The sensitivities of the island are quite remarkable with that, and there is a feeling that the man should be laid to rest back in the place he was put before. Now that may or may not be possible, but there is something sacred about that. He was there, he's been there for 4,000 years, who are we to mess about with him? Do we make a cast of the bones and put them on display and place him in some safe place? The question is there, but the question is fascinating, because it's not simply a question of bringing back the bones and putting them somewhere or putting them on display. This touches a depth of feeling on the island from islanders who have been there for generations, or whose families have been, and others who have more recently moved to the island. There is still something about that sacredness of where you are laid to rest. Dust to dust, earth to earth. Is that why we love the land so much? Because we know we'll go back to it. One of the things that came out of our access audit was an improvement in the waymarking on the island, an improvement of the paths. There are now 8 walks. One of the islanders then produced this booklet on those walks with lots of information provided by another elderly islander who had lived there all of his life. His reminiscences were recorded, written down, and a book produced, and some of the information that he gave is in that pamphlet of walks. But that's the information about the name of that stone, the name of that field, the name of that hill, all words that are, well, in many cases, which are Gaelic words, and the island is trying to preserve them. And the twist, of course, is when the Gages owned the island, I guess land access was a different kind of issue, and people walked around on the land and they knew what the names, and those names were passed on to their new generations. Now, as the land is fenced and owned by a different range of landowners for different uses, you can't do that. The children don't grow up walking across all of those fields and learning the names of all of these places, and that's slowly disappearing. So we do our projects with the children and some of the older people to try and restore some of that memory and keep it alive, but it's never going to be a real memory unless those children can walk across that land and touch it and feel it and have their experiences and their memories built in those places. The access audit told us where we could walk and where we couldn't walk, and that was the ticket that we used with the landowners, with the farmers, to say, this is why we're doing this. This isn't about taking more of your land. This is about giving tourists and others clear guidance on where they can walk. So hopefully there'll be less invasion of your fields. It also led to an additional permissive path. It's a fascinating name, that. A permissive path. The advantage is that the council will ensure that and they will look after it if a landowner will allow that path across their land. So one permissive path came out of that, which was new. There's a second one now being talked about. Again, crucial issue with the landowners who believed that anybody walking across their land, if they stumbled and fell, they would sue the farmers. That may or may not ever have been the case, but if permission is granted for one of these permissive paths, then the council would take that on. The farmer is exonerated. Again, you can say that, but is it heard? Is it believed? Because you have to get through the many, many years of suspicion, bad experience, baggage, fears, to get to any clarity. Road service, or Transport NI, also improved our directional signs. Actually, if you come in off the ferry, the signs used to say, let me think, how did it go? Whichever way you went, you could be going to the West Lighthouse or the East Lighthouse. The signs just told you anything you wanted to know. You could have gone in any particular direction to get to any of one of those. It was one of the most confusing images as you got off the ferry. How do you get to that lighthouse? Well, you go that way, or you go that way, or you go that way. I don't know how to do it anymore. Those signs clarified it, improved it. Some of those that were bent and damaged were improved. It took a few years, but they did it. And now we have the walking trails marked. So again, you know where to go, and in theory, you know where not to go. You don't need to know about all that stuff, do you? That's the RDCA working very carefully with the European Marine Site Management Scheme round the edges. But that's also how we might get rid of the rats and the ferrets and the geese. That's another story. And the nice bunny rabbit on there is our local biodiversity action plan, which was an attempt to work very closely with the school and with the older people on the island, again to try and capture something of the island's pride in its own location, its engagement with its land and the natural resources, rather than having that brought to us by an outside environmental agent who would tell us what we could do and what we couldn't do. So we started in that different place with the islanders saying, this is what it's about. And then we came up with that, there's one on the table there if you want to see one afterwards, I think a very interesting leaflet which talks about the townlands and tries to retain something of the original names and the stories of those. We work very closely with most of the government departments from Stormont. Some years ago there was an acceptance that policies that are rolled out across the rest of Northern Ireland might need tweaking slightly for Rathlin, because Rathlin is the only offshore inhabited island in Northern Ireland. That's been a long and complex process, but it is bearing fruit. We now have some very good, very strong relationships with key people from a number of those departments, and we have a ministerial forum that's chaired on the island by the Minister for Department for Infrastructure, or DRD as it used to be. And last week the Minister launched the new action plan. The action plan was created out of 3 days of consultations with government departmental agents, with outside agencies like the RSPB and the National Trust, and with the community. The community had the 3rd day and the others had the first 2 days, as well as some tremendous conversation around the rooms where people were coming out of their silos and beginning to recognise Rathlin as this many-layered mosaic rather than my department, this is my bit. We had 2 visual minuters who, as well as somebody scribbling it all down somewhere at the side, we had the artists who drew what was happening. So we now have these massive boards, that's one of them, that tells something of the story of the action plan. That's all online as well if you wanted to find that. Well, the environment is one of the aspects of that plan. This last slide is again from the process of working with the visual artists, not on the action plan but on a strategic plan that we'd gone through with the community. The idea simply being that well, we needed a new strategic plan, but we didn't want one of the old ones with a you know, a SWOT analysis and let's look at what's broken and what we have to fix and what are the challenges for us in the next few years, what have we got to do, what have we got to mend. We wanted to start with an asset-based approach. So the first questions individually, privately, to each member of the community that would participate, and we had, I think, 98 conversations individually with islanders out of about 120 at that stage, which is a pretty good percentage. The first question to them was, what do you like about living on the island? What are you proud of? What works? What would you want to see more of? What are you happy to share with other people? And you see they're already hearing me there. Yeah, that was somebody from the island. I must have said something. That and various other questions were then taken forward in these private conversations. But then at the end of that process, we brought together about 60 people in the pub, you know, bribery, sandwiches and a bit of music and whatever else you find in a pub. The same questions were then asked of the group together. And what started to happen was people began to say what they had had permission to say privately, and began to hear that other people were saying the same things. So it reinforced all of those conversations. And again, we had the visual minuters to lock all that away for us. You maybe won't read everything on there, but those are the essences of what it's like to live on Rathlin Island, what the islanders want to say about the island. What do they like about it? It is the freedom. There is actually, it says no flags on there, which is very important for Rathlin. It's a special place, landscape, stepping back in time, history. There's a connectedness with the place, with the land and the sea that surrounds it, and it's a strong, beautiful pride in where people live. And that's what it's about for us. I think that, for me, is more of the essence of Rathlin than all those other documents, all those strategies, all those planning arrangements, all those action plans and all the rest of it. All that's detail. That's how you actually get there. But this is what it's about, isn't it? The goal for all of our deliberations on land management and land ownership and community development is to live in a place you love and to feel identified with it, to enjoy it, to be proud of it, and to wake up in the morning knowing there's nowhere else you want to be because you're happy there and you're connected. It's the soul of the place, and all of the rest is detail. Amen.
Thank you very much, David. Has anybody any burning questions that they'd like to ask at this point, or will we get on to our next set of speakers? Okay, we'll batter on. Peter, is it yourself that's up next?
Yeah.
Okay. Please welcome Peter Peacock from Community Land Scotland.
Good, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm here with David Cameron, who is stand-up David or away, who will give the other half of the story we're going to try and tell you. And it's great to have the invitation to be here today. I've never been to Derry before, and I'm going to come back, and I'll probably visit the island too when I'm coming back. It's so great. What I want to do is try and tell you a story of a journey that Scotland is on, and it's a yet incomplete journey, about community empowerment. And community empowerment in the Scottish context is now explicitly seen as part of the way we achieve greater social justice in our society, how we achieve greater equalities, and how we progressively realise people's human rights to housing, to employment, to a better environment, to greater well-being, and so on and so forth. And it's done nowadays in the Scottish context in part through the ownership or the management of assets, and that could be buildings or it could be land, and it's the management of those particular assets. And it's driven by a desire to combat decline very often. Communities feeling their backs against the wall, that they're losing their identity, their culture, they're losing population, they're losing employment opportunities, there aren't new housing opportunities for people, and so on. And therefore it's about renewal and regeneration, and about taking responsibility for your place and developing your place in ways that suit your circumstances. And I think what we'll try and do today is show you that communities can do very small things very well, but they can also do very large things, remarkably large things very well also, and that's comparatively new to our scene. I'm going to set the context for this and try and give you some of the policy thinking that's been changing and the government thinking that's been changing, and some of the changes we've seen to law and to administrative practice that is allowing all of this to happen. And David will give you a couple of detailed case studies to try and bring all of that to life. We're not here, I just want to stress this, absolutely, we're not here to tell you or even suggest to you what you do or that you follow what we are doing. We're simply here to share with you what we are doing, and you can take out of it what you want. Every society, every community has got to move at their own stage of development that suits their cultural circumstances. And these are different things. You might pick up some things that you think are useful to you going forward, but you might not. That's up to you. And as I say, we're simply here to share. We're also going to talk about really quite different contexts, and you'll see some of that from what I'm about to say. And again, only you can judge what is, what you can benefit from. What I would say is this: that circumstances we'll describe are very different. But as I interact with people, literally now, I don't do this every day, I have to say, but occasionally, interact in international networks of people who are involved in land reform. What drives land reform in India or Bolivia or Colombia or in parts of Africa is almost identical to what's driving land reform in the Highlands of Scotland or in the rest of Scotland. People's desire to be more in control of their circumstances, people fighting back against losing their land in many parts of the world today, and people still dying in the cause of defending their land in quite astonishing circumstances around the globe, are exactly the same motivations that underpin what our people are doing at home. So that's kind of what we want to do. Just a quick word about Community Land Scotland as an organisation. We've only existed for 6 years. It was born out of a desire to bring together those community owners that were of land that were now existing in Scotland, provide mutual support to each other, a bit of knowledge exchange, help people develop, but also to influence the public policy agenda to try and make sure that the government was shaping up to support communities in what they were doing. And we've spent a lot of time in doing that. And the only reason we could be here today is through the efforts of the Carnegie UK Trust, who are funding us to share our story with other parts of the country outside Scotland. So that's the kind of broad position of why we're here. Now I'll try and give you some of the context of what we've been up to and why we're there, and give you some of the history and political context. Scotland had land grabs that you're seeing now in other parts of the world a couple of centuries or more ago, where people acquired by one means or another that would not be recognised in today's law, huge, literally huge areas of land. And we didn't have the land reforms that Ireland had at the early part of the 20th century. We've got the most highly concentrated pattern of land ownership anywhere in the developed world. Quite extraordinary. 431 people own 50%, that should be at the top, 50% of all Scotland's privately owned land. To put it another way, 0.002 people own 60% of Scotland's private land. Huge imbalance in power as a consequence of that. Private land is 85% of Scotland. The remainder is largely forestry estates owned by the state or local authority land, or sites owned by public authorities like health boards and so on. And much ownership is not transparent. We don't actually know who owns a lot of that land. Some of it is in the ownership of companies registered in Panama, in the British Virgin Islands and so on. And people hide behind shell companies, and we don't actually know who owns a lot of our land. And that's true around the world, actually. And much of that land ownership pattern, because people owned vast areas of land, it allowed in our history the clearances, where a notorious part of Highlands and Islands history, but also in other parts of Scotland, was where people were evicted in huge numbers, thousands upon thousands of people evicted from their land to make way for sheep, that the big landowners then use as their way of making a lot of money at that time, because sheep were extremely valuable for wool in particular. So the ownership pattern allowed a very major change in how land was occupied. And because of that, land became a political cause, a very strong political cause. And there was all sorts of demonstrations by people. There were riots, people were jailed for reoccupying land, and people did literally reoccupy land. And that gave rise to the first bit of land reform in the recent past, which was that crofters, and crofters in Scotland are smallholders, think of crofting as equally smallholding, that ended up, after a long process, of giving crofters absolute security of tenure so that the clearances could never happen again. And that security of tenure still exists to this day. And debates about land reform, because of those kind of changes and the awareness by not a lot of people, but by some people, of the disproportionate way in which land was owned, caused a lot of debate throughout the 20th century, but actually very little action towards any further real reform. And what happens is that our ownership patterns increasingly concentrate influence in very few people's hands, they concentrate power, and increasingly it concentrates wealth in very few hands. If you own the land, you get the wind farm subsidies. If you own the land, you get the forestry grant subsidies and the tax breaks. If you own the land, you get the rentals from the telephone masts and so on and so forth. So it has an effect on our society which is damaging in that sense. And throughout the debates in the recent past, it's become recognised that Scotland requires a greater diversity of ownership for the kind of reasons I set out about greater equality, greater social justice and so on, but it also takes you into hugely controversial territory, because if you've got a finite amount of land and you want more owners of land, that can only come from one place, and that's generally the bigger landowners. And that creates a huge political tension, and it also creates a power struggle effectively, and in part that's what we've been going through. Sorry, my slide got slightly out of order there, but I've made that point anyway. And then we had some local struggles in the end of the 1900s, the 1980s, 1990s. The first name there, Assynt, in the northwest of the Highlands. An estate came on the market, as they often did at that time, a big estate, big shooting estate, on which a number of crofters lived. And the crofters basically, at that point, they thought the estate was going to get broken up and they wanted to take action. So they mounted an open market bid to buy the land. And again, after a struggle, they managed to secure the land, the first group to buy the land. And I think it's about 40,000 acres or something of that sort, a big piece of ground. And that then led to other changes. The people on the island of Egg, shortly thereafter, got inspiration from the Assynt crofters, and they bought their island, again, on the open market. And then the people of Knoydart did the same, and they did that in conjunction with some conservation agencies, the John Muir Trust in that particular instance, who helped fund that, and they also bought their land. But that all gave inspiration to lots of other communities saying, what is happening here, and look what's happening here, and can we do something of the same? And it also gave impetus. But no rights existed. These were remarkable buyouts, and they happened to be able to raise the money at that point in time, but you could never guarantee doing that throughout time. These were particularly isolated examples. And then the 1997 UK election gave rise to devolution and the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. And that was the first time, in 1987, the then Labour government coming to power in the Scotland office, Scottish office of the then Labour government, they set up a land review policy group, and it began to prepare the ground for how you would tackle the question of tackling the imbalance in ownership and how you empowered communities in that context. And then when the Scottish Parliament came into power, they created the first piece of legislation. And the first Land Reform Act of the new devolved settlement was in 2003. And that was seen as very progressive. It formalised the right to roam that somebody mentioned. It's actually the responsible right of access, technically, but it's known as the right to roam. So any Scot, any visitor to Scotland can roam on any land, provided they do it responsibly, and you cannot be refused access to the land. And it also, that act gave the first community rights to buy land, and it gave community rights to buy land to the crofting communities in the north and west, but also any rural community under 10,000 population got certain rights to buy land, which I'll come on and explain in a minute or two. But we also discovered after peer reviews that the law is extremely complex, it's very difficult to use for communities, and it's not empowering enough. There were certain things you couldn't do within the framework of the law that was created. Nonetheless, it was a major step forward, and it was breaking new ground. However, the reform debate was also dominated by the human rights of existing landowners. Under the European Convention of Human Rights, people have got a right to enjoy their private possessions, their property. It was never written for Highland lairds, let me tell you. It was written to protect smaller communities and minorities against the Nazis. It followed the last war. But anyway, it was being, every time we talked about land reform, the landowning groups in Scotland would jump up and say, you cannot reform land reform, we've got absolute rights to our property. In fact, they didn't have. But I'll come on to tell you a wee bit more about that. But also what was happening was that the government was seeing what was happening on the ground, where communities were getting control of assets. They were very impressed by what was going on. There was a new confidence in places. Things were happening that didn't used to happen. Employment was growing, housing was increasing in supply in those particular communities. And they simply wanted to see more of it. And therefore, that takes me to the recent context. The government set up the Land Reform Review Group back about 2010, 2011. And it reported in 2014, and it said something at the heart of their report which fundamentally changed thinking about land policy in Scotland. It was this statement: land is a finite and crucial resource that requires to be owned and used in the public interest and for the common good. Now, prior to this time, the debate about land was largely that land was a market matter. It was a private owned matter, and the market would dictate what happened to all of that land. This changed the question of land into a public interest matter and how land was used for the common good, whether it was privately owned, publicly owned, or community owned, or whatever. And that land reform policy is now explicitly seen in Scotland as a means to deliver, as I touched on earlier, wider social economic policy, greater fairness and social justice, greater equalities, and human rights that I touched on earlier. Further legislation has since been enacted. Private property rights that I just touched on are now balanced with requirements for ministers in taking decisions about community ownership of land to have regard to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of Communities. And that again has changed the nature of debate, and it's balanced up the arguments about human rights, so that when the landowners had traditionally said you cannot have land reform because it impacts on our human rights, we were jumping up and saying, yeah, but what about our human rights? We've got human rights too. We've got human rights to housing and to employment and to better well-being and greater prosperity in our lives. And that's being impeded by the land ownership pattern, in our view. So we've moved the law on to consider these things today. So where are we now? Well, we've got 3 acts of Parliament that empower communities. We've got the Land Reform Act of 2003, we've got the Community Empowerment Act of 2015, and we've got the Land Reform Act of just earlier this year. So we've seen 2 big acts of Parliament in 2 years, which are changing the dynamics of how the land debate occurs, but also empowering communities to own more assets. And those community land rights provide for the following. First of all, in relation to private land, we've got what we call a willing seller framework. So where the landowner is going to bring land to the market or is a willing seller of that land. Now, any community in Scotland, and that's now changed, it used to be under rural communities only, any community in the heart of Glasgow or in the most remote rural place of Scotland can register an interest to buy land or to register an interest in a piece of land that they've got in their locality. And as and when that land comes on the market, the community have got the first right to buy that. Nobody else can buy it, and if the community don't want to buy it, it's only then that it could go to the wider market. And that's pretty significant. A community that registers an interest knows that if the land was going to change hands, as it often does in Scotland, then they've got the first right to buy that. A pretty powerful piece of legislation. You can also, if the land comes onto the market suddenly and you didn't anticipate it, if you can make a case that it's in the public interest for you to have that land, you can stop the sale of that land by a late registration of interest. It's not easy to achieve, and you've got to demonstrate that would be in the public interest, but it has happened. We have had late registrations made. We've also got a non-willing seller framework, and this is where we've moved forward in the recent past pretty dramatically. So that even if an owner doesn't want to sell land, but it could be regarded in the public interest that it changed hands, communities have now got rights, potential rights to buy that. So you can buy the land even if the owner doesn't want to sell in very particular circumstances. It requires the approval of Scottish ministers, so you've got to persuade them to do that. And it's a last resort power. You had to have offered to buy the land, and that's been refused before you could begin to trigger the powers. And you could use that since 2003 if you're a crofting community, and we've got one example where that has happened. It went back, it went to the courts, and it took 14 years to settle. But the community eventually got the right to buy their land and are now the owners of that land against the wishes of the owner. Any community where the land is abandoned or neglected, or is causing harm to the environmental well-being of the community, or the purchase is likely to further the achievement of sustainable development, and it's in the public interest, and that's a high hurdle, then potentially a community can buy the land. I'm not going to suggest to you this is easy, but the powers and the framework is there to empower communities to do that. However, we take the view that negotiation is preferable to the law. The law is still highly complex and difficult to manage. But the new community rights I've just mentioned to you has completely changed the nature of the debate between communities and landowners. Landowners now do not know whether a community might exercise its rights to buy land, that was just set out, and they don't know what the courts might say. The one court case we've had found in favour of the community, not the landowner, and that has concentrated the minds of landowners wonderfully. But it's also changed the nature of the debate, and most sales today are by negotiation. And I should have said earlier that our members collectively own and manage 500,000 acres of land, and that total is growing. So there's much more negotiation goes on, but it's all done in the shadow of that stronger law. Had the law not been strengthened, we don't think the negotiations would have been possible. Private landowners, however, and ourselves, who are not natural bedfellows, not natural allies, on the back of that changed agreement, we've negotiated between us a voluntary protocol to guide the sale of land to communities. So we're recommending that protocol to our members or prospective members, and the Scottish Land and Estates, the big private owning, land owning interests, are recommending it to their members. And what that does is, if you're a community and you want to buy land, It explains how you go about approaching the owner, what information you should supply, what the owner is likely to ask for, and so on, and then sets out a process to be followed to get to a conclusion of a potential sale. And equally, if the owner is thinking of selling, it sets out a process of how they connect to a community, what the community, what they should be asking the community to do, how do they establish the interest, and how do they negotiate that. And that's a recognition of changing times. That would simply not have been possible 4 years ago, but now we're negotiating most sales at a community level, and that protocol is an agreement between the two sides of how best to do that, and it's pretty powerful as a consequence. And we also got a power in recent legislation for government ministers to fund mediation between communities and landowners, and that recognises this is a complex process and that sometimes it's difficult, and mediation can be brought to bear to help the development of a potential sale. And then we've got also rights to public assets. Again, new. This was in the Community Empowerment Act of 2015, and it's a right for any community to seek to have the transfer of public assets into their ownership or into a leasing arrangement. Now that would apply to state forestry, it would apply potentially to local authority or government agency land or buildings, and it also applies to potentially to the Crown Estate. We're actually still working out whether it does apply to the Crown Estate, because in Scotland the Crown Estate is being devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and the Crown Estate in parts of Scotland is a much reviled organisation, I can tell you. There's been huge controversy about it, part of the reason why it's being devolved, but potentially their assets come under the terms of the Community Empowerment Act as well, but yet to be finally determined. And we've got a range of other supporting policies in place now. The government set a target, announced at one of our conferences. The First Minister turned up, and much to the surprise of his civil servants, announced that the government was setting a target to double the amount of community-owned land from that 500,000 acres I mentioned to 1 million acres by 2020. And they're now got a strategy, a detailed strategy of how they're going to deliver that by putting in place various support mechanisms for communities. One of those things is we've got a £10 million a year annual land fund, so that communities who are buying land can apply to the land fund and get quite significant sums of money to potentially buy that asset. The lottery has got funding streams that help the community thereafter to develop the land in a variety of ways and employ a development officer and the like. And these two things are hugely important. And there's, I'll maybe come back to that. The other point to make about this is that even if the law had not changed, having these two last things would help drive a number of opportunistic purchases. So those two things would allow progress to be made, but the changing of the law is really what's underpinning and driving all this. And the other thing the government are currently just consulting on is to create a new register of property in Scotland where all beneficial owners, the people who sit behind the shell companies, must be named, or you can't register your property in Scotland. And that's a pretty dramatic change, and that will help that transparency of land ownership be understood better and empower communities to approach the real owners and try and purchase land if that's what they want to do. So there'll be no hidden ownerships in future. So what I would conclude with all of that? Well, community land ownership has become a driver of social reform in the ways that I've described earlier, to increase local enterprise and responsibility, and then all these other things: confidence, participation, sustainable development, economic growth, capacity, resilience, power and influence, investment. You could add to that cultural dimensions, following our breakfast conversation with some of you. And so explicitly community ownership is delivering some of these things. And we are seeing quite remarkable things happening at a local level. Once a community owns its assets, a release of energy, a release of enterprise, a taking of responsibility, and a whole range of developments that David will illustrate in a minute beginning to take place. We've discovered that achieving land reform is a process, it's not an event. There are some people on the political spectrum who would like it to be a one-off event. It isn't. It's a long process. It can be hugely controversial. It affects the power relationships in society. On the other hand, the government in Scotland, with opposition support, are recognising that if you do more of this, you enrich the life of places, you strengthen them, you give them more sustainable futures, and that's why people are moving along the road that I've described. And it can be achieved by consent. It doesn't have to be on the basis of conflict. There are conflicts, but also we've discovered the best way to do it, as I've touched on, is through negotiation and consent, and we're showing that is entirely achievable. So this does not have to be a controversial matter if you can bring people together, talk about the issues, share appreciation of why people want to do this, and then you can make progress. So that's me. Thanks for listening, and we'll take questions later, I suppose, after David's spoken. Thank you very much.
David, you right?
Well, good morning everybody, and first thing I want to say is thank you very much. We had a tremendous welcome yesterday, and the hospitality so far has been the same standard. We've had an excellent start to this day and a half over here. My role in Community Land Scotland, which is the umbrella body for communities all over Scotland, my role is speaking with people like yourselves who have expressed an interest, but more frequently I'm found in village halls in different places talking to communities. So I'm quite used to heckling. You seem a very civilised audience, but feel free to heckle. And it's usually at the first stages when these communities are looking at the possibility of taking ownership. This is the question that is probably in most people's minds, not just today, but when you go to these communities. Why are we here this evening, this afternoon, this morning? Why are we here? Why community ownership? And this question applies whether we're talking about 93,000 acres of bare land, or a derelict building, a woodland, a water reservoir, the foreshore, or an American air base. Now, these bits of purchase have all succeeded by members of Community Land Scotland. And there's quite a difference between these different purchases. But there is a common thread woven through all our members, not just these ones I mentioned. The common thread is that the community empowerment that occurs when you actually purchase land through community ownership, or purchase an asset into community ownership. So over the next 15-20 minutes or so, I will at least try to partly answer that question, why community ownership? And then you can take perhaps bits of it and put it into your own situation here in Northern Ireland. This is what Community Land Scotland, when I say we, our members, as a director we're proposed elected by our members. We are a grassroots organisation. But this is what we believe, and it doesn't matter if it's a single asset or a big chunk of land, that 4 elements are very necessary to come together to make it a success. And the first one is the community desire. It has to come from within. It's bottom-up development, and the community have got to believe in what they're doing. The second one is the adequate initial funding, because land and assets can be expensive. Communities lack confidence, but they also lack capital. So that money has to be supplied, and in Scotland it comes through the Scottish Land Fund. You have to have appropriate support, and appropriate because every community on this planet have got strengths and weaknesses, and we feel it's up to you need external support to come in to fill these gaps until the community itself generates the knowledge that enables them to run it 100% at the end of the day. And again, we have that in Scotland through government agencies, through the Highlands and Islands Enterprise Board, and people like that, and through Community Land Scotland ourselves, because we've built up a huge amount of knowledge, and we're moving now beyond the purchase stage and looking at post-purchase challenges, because somebody out there will have tried what somebody new is trying to do, and between us we can make a better job of it. And the bottom, the fourth, is really Peter's expertise, an area that's really moved us along so much. This is the political will backed by legislation. You've got to have the political will behind it, both at local level and at national level. And that was one of the hardest. Local is sometimes harder to crack than national, but that bit was probably the hardest bit to crack. But you can tell from what Peter said that now is well and truly in place. Sorry. Burrowing down a little bit further, Community Land Scotland, our members believe, and we're talking more about land because land's in our title now, but it can really refer to assets as well. That what's a thriving community? And a thriving community for us in an island situation, and it might be the same in Rathlin, and it was interesting, you could have been speaking about the Western Isles, David could have been speaking about them. A lot come back to children. You go ashore at Inveree in Neudert, you go ashore at the island of Gea, and they say, what difference has it made community land ownership? What are you most proud of? And they'll tell you the school roll has gone up. So a thriving community, in our opinion, is one that needs young people. And therefore you need families, not to stay in the area or to come into the area. And to get a family to be happy in an area, you need these 4 things. You need jobs, you need a good housing, it can be rentable or it can be bought, it doesn't really matter. You need a decent environment to live in. And lastly, you've got a good job, a good house, you like your neighbour, so you want something to do at the weekend. I come from North Harris, and I don't want to talk too much because this slot I've got normally takes half an hour, and I'm trying to compress it to 15 minutes. But this is just to illustrate geographically that this is the north end of the island. It's where I've been born, brought up my own family. It's a mountainous area. It is different, so hold that picture in your mind as we move on. We bought the community at the buyout in 2003. It's a 63,500 acre estate, a population of about 800. 500 live in the main village, the rest are spread out along the coastal strip. A high percent of older people, shortage of housing, lack of jobs, lack of variety of jobs. And that leads to closures. Even today, although we've got a very good tourist business, the bank is still only open 3 days a week, from 10 o'clock till 3 o'clock. And as sure as fate at the weekend, the ATM goes down and no tourists can get money to spend. Really frustrating. And young people leave. In my primary class in Harris, there are about 17 people. 2 of us have managed to spend our life on the island. Everybody else went. But what's happened since community took over the land? I'll rattle through this bit particularly quick. Investing in infrastructure, that pier on the left, a jetty on the west side. Renewable energy. This was one of the first ones. It's only a 10 kilowatt turbine, and we've moved a long way since then. There are now 500 kilowatts, and there's a hydro scheme just been commissioned for 100 kilowatts. Inward investment. You can't do everything yourself. Build partnerships, bring people in. And finally, at the bottom, recycling and energy conservation. We suffer a lot from fuel poverty. Housing. If you're buying an asset, buy as much as you can afford, because you never know what you're going to need or what you can need into the future. Housing is a good thing to invest in because it will give an income stream way into the future, long after the initial excitement has died away and you need money coming in. Housing is a very, very good investment. The picture on the right, 8 units of social housing, again demonstrating partnership. You provide the land, in come the housing associations, and you want to get the population up, you want to get younger people. You try and influence the points awarded so you get young families in, and that's a good example, 8 houses. The bottom left is right in the middle of the village. It's quite a large building. The trust now made a bit of money, and they've now invested in this property. They built it themselves with commercial mortgages, 2 2-bedroom flats above and a suite of offices below. Environment. It was interesting hearing about the Rathlin tracks again, the walking areas. We've got 54 kilometres, 36 miles of track. In the old days people used to walk on it, but now there's quads, there's mountain bikes, there's horses, there's everything. And they're not lasting, but we've got to make them last. And it's very difficult to get money in for keeping paths up to a standard. A very simple eagle hide, it's 1.5 miles off the road. But every year there are actually thousands of people now visit that small building, a mile and a half off the road. And it's one of those ironic things as well. The glass frontage points up the valley where the eagles have nested for years. The moment that was up, they started nesting behind. It gives the land ranger something to do, to tell them to look on the road up to it. And the bottom right, we've gone into environmental woodland. It's supposed to improve the salmon spawning beds and the upper waters of some of our rivers. So we've put in forestry. We'll see if it works. It's been hand planting, more expensive, hand planting, hand mounding, but at least it's introducing skills into the community at the same time. Social and culture, just getting groups of people together to have a bit of fun. Top left, just a raft race. The youngsters in the area, you can't keep youngsters on the island. You want them to go out and learn something, but I think our generation have got a role to create opportunities for them to come back to, if they so desire it in time. So taking youngsters out, Duke of Edinburgh Award, things like that, that all happens in North Harris, and it helps them to know what we've actually got. Bottom left is a Gaelic culture, so we use Gaelic language on the signs. It confuses some people. It's okay if they're similar, but sometimes Leverborough is actually Antob, totally different. So on the signpost you see people wondering where's Leverborough, and it's just not on the signpost. But it's our culture, so it's there. And a mountain festival in its 5th year, a week at the end of September when the tourist season is dying off. Then it takes people to the island, and it's growing every single year. And it's not just climbing mountains. We've got films, we've got events running during the whole week. I'm now moving to West Harris. Now again, think back in your mind to North Harris with the mountainous area. This is West Harris, same island, just on the boundary of North Harris and West Harris over a matter of probably about 5, 6, 7 miles. It's a common boundary, but at the same time it's totally different. You can tell there's less rock, there's more grazing, it's lower, and it's different. And just to get across the point that every community is different. If you came to Harris, you would think Harris is one big community, but if you actually live in it, you realise it's not just one big community. All the people work together, but West Harris is a different community to North Harris. And because of that, they've looked at their buyout and the development of their land differently from North Harris. They're working from a much lower base. 5 townships, 16,700 acres, and it was actually purchased from the Scottish Government. I think that sums up their situation in a nutshell. In 2010 it had a population of 119 and there was only 1 child under 5. Just to get the message home, business premises 0, social housing for rent 0, private housing for rent 0, dedicated community facilities. We're very honest, we say dedicated because the school, which has so few children now, had a spare classroom and the community were allowed to use that. So they did have a community facility, but it didn't belong to them and they had to ask for permission to use it. Holiday homes, 40% of the properties. We were talking about numbers earlier. I think West Harris were very brave because they actually said, right, we're going to put numbers and these are our goals. Initial target in the first 5 years, they wanted to increase the population to 130. That's only 11. If you remember 119, that's only 11. But that's somewhere like 9%. Now if you did that across rural areas everywhere, you really would have a very changed pattern of living, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, and I would suspect in a lot of rural Ireland as well. It takes 5 years to build up momentum. It's not a quick job. And this is one of the other problems, is dampening people's expectations, because people expect things to change overnight and they don't. 5 years, I would say you should begin to see things happening. So you see they're prophesying an increase in the rate of population, 170 people living in West Harris by 2020. Very ambitious. And the 2 bottom targets. One was getting more younger people in, that reflects that. In fact, they both do. They started off by, in our part, they're probably smaller projects. That's a 50 kilowatt turbine. They also put a pontoon out into the sea. It's very difficult to get moorings, but there were visual signs that the community could hang on to and say, look what we're doing. So they're very valuable. That looks like just like an agricultural shed, and that's exactly what it is. But in that building, a third of it is used by the crofters themselves. There's a sheep bank just off picture, and that's where they store all their stuff. There is a marine business there. A person came back to the island who'd been in the services, and his speciality was underwater sea surveys. And he's set up in there. And because we're surrounded by the sea, marine development of renewable energy is growing. He's in the right place, and already he is pretty busy. And the third business in is a person again who's come in, and he takes old Volkswagen Caravanets. You remember the kind with flowers stuck on the side? I can tell by the smile the age of everybody. And he renovates them, and he rents them out at £100 a day in the summertime. So you can come to Harris, you can hire your Volkswagen Caravanet, you can play Beach Boys tapes, and you can cruise past the beaches that you see in the background. At the same time, there is that bit of land down there. It's 7 acres, and it's crofting land, but the community were lucky enough to get that land with no restrictions on it. Somebody resumed it, didn't want it, and said, community, you can have it, do what you like with it. We spoke about a feasible part of the process of purchasing is asking the community what the gaps were and what they felt should be done in the area. And that's what the community came up with at the beginning. And I'm not going to go through the list. I mean, it's quite comprehensive, but it's all tied back to the original 4, the jobs, the housing, the environment, and the social. Even at the time, they did a mock-up of what they were going to do in the 7 acres, and people saw it, thought that's really pie in the sky. There you go. That's the main building, and that main building you can, in a few months' time, if anyone's looking for a wedding venue, you can get married on the beach and have your reception in that place. It'll be a restaurant, it's a community space, there are business units at one end, and it's there. That was probably about 10 months ago. And the site's been developed further now. That building I showed you from a different angle is the one in the back. It's 95% complete. Housing is going up in the buildings near at the front of the picture. And I was past it last week, and the scaffolding's away. And I would imagine there'll be people in there by the end of the year. So that community ambition, the first trawl, if you like, of what the community wanted to do, that's now community reality. Now there's numbers to these, and that is what will actually happen on that 7-acre site, with a little bit he added in, because during the time they were developing, they got money for a 100 kilowatt turbine on the hill behind, so they're using renewable energy on that particular site. And keep bearing in mind, this is a community of 119 people, 1 under 5. Funding partners. I don't know how many of these funding partners are relevant here. The big lottery funding, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, that are the local development enterprise, the Cornwall, which is the local council, Coastal Communities Fund, which is money through the Crown Estate, and the Scottish Government themselves. That whole 7 acres is fully funded. It's between 1.75 million and 2 million. The key points, this is thinking out of the box, but these are the points from the development manager of West Harris. It's ambition, flexibility, be creative, build partnerships again. Communities can't always do it on their own. Build partnerships. And funny, when we went round with Gerard yesterday, you were talking exactly the same. A lot of things happen because of partnerships. Seize appropriate opportunities. You never know what's coming along. It could be fish farming in a freshwater loch nothing's happened for centuries. It could be marine development offshore. But if you see something coming and a community owns it, they are the focus of attention from day one, and they've got to grab it. And this is at the bottom, owning the land makes a difference. And I could add in there, owning an asset makes a difference. Somebody said if you hire and drive a car, you rent it, you use it, the same thing, but it's not the same. You don't look after it the same as if you actually own it. And I guarantee you, I've seen it over and over again, that when communities begin to own something, particularly land, it releases an energy within that community that I have never seen happen in any other way. And I remember quite a while ago somebody saying they were watching a football match and the passion there is in a football match, and saying if you could take that passion and put it into the 5 days work these people at the football match are doing, wouldn't things be different? It's the way you look at things. And if you got steamed up about community land ownership, I guarantee you can literally move mountains. So there you are. This is emphasising again bringing the two pictures together, because that's North Harris on the other side of that arm of the sea, and again stressing the mountainous nature. And this is your softer sandy beach, nice arable Macherland. Different communities, and again stressing the point that each of these communities are doing things for themselves in the way their community wants. It is bottom-up approach. It's never been tried before, and I've seen so much money come into Harris, and I have to be honest, wasted. But I guarantee you, give it to the community and they'll make sure that every pound is spent well. You see I'm heading to 20 minutes already, so very quickly. And this, I didn't know Peter was going to show that slide, because I'm trying to answer the question now. The initial 4 modern purchases, and I call it modern because there are 2 purchases in Scotland going back to the 1920s, but then there was a long gap, and then it came into the 1990s. Ascent Crofters, Egg, Noidert, Gea, and they all purchased their land because there was no other place to go. They had to, otherwise they would have just, by this time there would just be a name and a map and nobody there. But thereafter, the magic word, and I think for North Harris, West Harris, all the other ones that have come along, the Machrihanish Air Base, they see the word opportunity for themselves. And that's the word opportunity, and some other person used the word opportunity already this morning. So that is why community asset ownership and community land ownership is worthwhile. And finally, this is an external person's idea of why community land ownership in this case is important, because it allows local people, where the power is, to really focus on the needs of their own communities. West Harris focused on their needs, North Harris focused on North Harris needs, which allows them to develop further than if they are reliant on public sector funding. This, John Watt was Director of Strengthening Communities at that time. This is a quote from 2010, just after we started out in Highlands and Islands Enterprise. But he now is Chair of the Scottish Land Fund. So that's it. Can I just, before I head back to the table, on your table you will have these green sheets. It's just a guide, it's just something to take away, to look at, and just perhaps trigger thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the speakers this morning. I think the words I'm taking away from it anyway are ambition, reality and opportunity, and I really like that. So we've reached the point now. Is there any burning questions that anybody has? We're about to enter some workshops, and we're going to have tea and coffee as well, so if you have something that you want to ask that maybe isn't for the room to hear, that'd be grand. Mary, a quick one?
Yes, the quick one is Community Land Scotland. We do not have a Community Land Northern Ireland. Community Land Scotland, linking in with the Scottish Government and setting up the Community Empowerment Programme, which is a government-led programme assisting communities in the endeavours that you've just described. How important was setting up Community Land Scotland?
Community Land Scotland was formed by 17 people from across Scotland who had been working in community lands in North Harrison since 2003, and we were formed in 2010. And we really formed because we just were sitting around and we were just aware, as far as we were concerned, that the momentum had gone out of what we saw as a good Scottish story. We were seeing successes in our own areas. We were lucky that we knew each other, so we could phone each other up. I could phone up Angela in Neudert, I could phone up some in Maggie and Gia, and we could discuss things. And we could, perhaps one lot had done housing, and North Harris were looking at housing, so we could talk to each other and work through problems. But there was a sense of frustration, and just personal frustration. This was a really good Scottish story, a different way of doing things, and it appeared to be working. And to be fair to, we had a meeting and thought, well, can we do something about it? So Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we convinced them, and they gave us a small sum of money to gather people together in this business and just sit round the table and say, could we have an umbrella group? And would they fund an umbrella group? And they said, prove that you really need it. So we proved it. And it started from there. We're all volunteers. I'm a volunteer. All the directors are volunteers. We're all either have to be proposed, seconded, and elected on by our members. And there was 17 founder members. That's all. And at that stage, or even when we were going through the North Harris buyout, I had no idea that this was going to sort of evolve. And at the end of the day, I have to be honest, you can probably tell, I'm more comfortable in a village hall environment where people are starting out than in some of the higher level stuff that's going on just now. But that higher level stuff is what has cracked it. Absolutely, the political will at national and local level.
Thank you.
I would just add to that the you know, from a kind of point of view of how do you get the attention of government, it's been absolutely fundamental that Community Land Scotland has existed, because it's now seen as a body that has got access to that kind of experience and can help inform government thinking. And we're frequently approached by government and policy officials to try and work out what is it you're doing, what makes that work, what doesn't make it work, what can we do, because government genuinely just wants to see more of this. I mean, when they did the Community Empowerment Act in 2015 it was approved, so it was really running through Parliament the 2 previous years. Quite literally, civil servants came out from the political masters, so to speak, with a blank sheet of paper, and they simply said, look, ministers are seeing this kind of stuff that David's described, and we want to see more of it. How do we do it? And we constructed, in partnership almost, between ourselves and the Development Trust Association Scotland and the Community Woodlands Association, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and so on, we created the kind of the asks of government and illustrated how it could be done, and the Act was really built around all of that. So as in giving a focus, giving a way in which you can draw attention to these arguments, giving it coherence and articulating them has been hugely significant in how we've been able to move forward. But also we are, you know, we're pretty determined, and there's a kind of underlying cause here that motivate a lot of people, and we have made it clear what we want out of legislation, why we want it, and if we can create the legislative framework, a lot of what David's described, communities will pick up and do the rest. So it has been very significant. You know, without Community Land Scotland, I'm not saying this because I'm part of it, because I wasn't part of it originally. Without it, it'd be hard to see how some of the changes that I've set out for you today would actually have happened, because we pushed most of that and we were actually moving, you know, we were preparing amendments to the law and persuading MSPs to move those amendments, persuading government ministers to include certain things to create that framework, but then from which, as I told you, we're much more negotiating now than before.
That's very good, thank you very much, and therefore I do hope that you speak to the right people like the DV, TNI and NICFA and various other strategic thinkers and policy influencers to set up the same sort of Northern Ireland land ownership and Northern Ireland.
I think you'll have to set it up. We'll help you. You need to set it up.
Laura, you want to come there?
Just ask a question.
Dennis.
Quite a number of the presentations have mentioned wind and turbines and hydro. Could you tell us the importance of renewable energy in the movement?
It's been very, very significant, and one of the worries we've got because of the changing subsidy regimes and incentive regimes, it's making it much less viable. But if you own the land, you're part way there because you can do things, on your own land. So what's happening? We're seeing more small-scale hydro, I think, now than wind. We've got some members who have got very large wind turbines. We've got one in South Uist who's got 3. You understand this? How many? What's it?
2.3 megawatts.
2.3 megawatts each. That community made £1 million net profit last year, and that £1 million net profit partly goes into funding local voluntary organisations and local initiatives. They've got a kind of mini bank, almost loan scheme for helping create enterprises and investing in the estate in terms of access and all that kind of stuff. If you go to the island of Egg, they ran on the island of Egg their energy through diesel. They imported diesel and they had diesel generators for their homes. The island of Egg called a meeting to say, this is dirty, we don't like this, and it's expensive. I cut a very long story short, they have now installed their own electricity grid on the island. They weren't connected to the mainland. So they've got a combination of PV cells, a big array of PV cells of about 4 or 5 small turbines now, and 2 hydro schemes. And as long as they work in harmony and they've got a big battery store, they can power the entire island, and that's made a huge difference. And you're seeing a lot of smaller scale schemes. It provides revenue because of the way the system has worked, and that has helped finance other things. So it's a big component, but it's not the only component. The housing stuff, we've got members running hotels and bunk houses and so on and so forth, and all of that contributes to how they survive. And the more diverse they are economically, you think of a community owner of these bigger ones as multifunctional businesses. They're running traditional shooting estates, selling fishing, selling deer hunting. They're investing in drainage on the land. They're running the bunkhouse, as I said, or the hotel. They're doing bird hides. They're doing a bit of energy. They're building houses. They're renovating houses. They're planting new forests. They're harvesting existing forests. So they're potentially quite big enterprises, and that allows you to ride some of the storms of economic difficulty because one bit of the enterprise might be doing better than the rest. But equally, we've got members appearing in cities who own one building and who are using that as a resource to begin the process of partnering with others to do all sorts of different projects. So there are a whole variety of different models. It's not just big estates. But David, you were on the board of Community Enterprise Scotland, Community Energy Scotland.
Yeah, we were lucky, and it just shows you grab an opportunity as it goes past, because there's no doubt the people who bought land early and put in wind turbines are sitting pretty. No exaggeration that some can't give the money away because they just haven't got enough projects to suck up all the money that's coming in. Now it's changed, and again there's a bit of adaptation because when we started out we always said own the turbines 100%. The Co-op Bank, the Traders Bank supported communities doing it, but these days have gone. Both North Harris and West Harris, it's a bit I didn't make clear. Although we're separate, we do work together. For example, there's a hydro scheme going into both communities using the same turbines and using the same construction company, and that helps both because it puts the price down. But that's being done in partnership with the mainland people with an option to buy it back in 5 years. Wind turbine in North Harris, 3 wind turbines, is with a New Zealand company. And again, a joint arrangement with them because it's a very risky site and the community felt the risk was slightly too much. So this New Zealand company came in, so that's a partnership. So I think you will find in the energy field more and more and more partners, and you will find more hydro in our part of the world compared to wind. Wind turbines onshore, where we are, have almost had their day for communities.
Okay, Tony, last question over to you then before we
I have a
break.
question for David. David, you talked about the West Harris example in terms of the community buyout. And I'm just keen to establish in terms of the actual financial consideration or fee for that. Was it at full market value from the Scottish Government, or was there a discount applied?
I'd love to say they got it cheaply. No, they didn't. It's probably an example of how not to do it. I don't know if there are any government civil servants in here, but the big problem was they kept having to speak to a new one. The North Harris purchase went through again with a private landowner in a year and about 15 months. It took the West Harris 3 years, and they had to pay full market value. And the other little snag was that the big lottery said, well, we're not going to fund you because we're not giving our money to the government. So there's a move going on in Scotland just now about, because we're now Community Land Scotland are much closer to the Scottish Government than we were then. And a lot of our road has been getting other people to understand what we're about. And there is a move within Scottish Government just now that government-owned land is going to be viewed differently. I don't know if you want to add something to that, so Peter will add to that. But no, very difficult. The government didn't make it easy at all.
You've touched on a really significant issue and there's currently guidance being written to implement the Community Empowerment Act. So guidance is being written by the Scottish Government with stakeholder involvement about some of these questions, about how do you, if you're a public authority, how do you actually do it? You know, we've got a situation where under the Public Finance Manual, which will apply to Northern Ireland, but will be interpreted by the Assembly in particular ways, but fundamentally the rules are the same, that officials in government firmly believe in Scotland, even though it's not correct, that they cannot dispose of assets below market value. Actually, they can. The problem is if you're the accountable officer for that budget, and similarly in a local authority who've actually got more discretion in this, but you have to account for that in the annual accounts of the government. You've got to say why I granted a discount, and that exposes people. How do you calculate the discount? How do you value it? You've got to show it on the balance sheet. If you've got targets within government, you know, if you're part of the Forestry Commission or whatever, and you've got to raise income to fund other investment, you're not going to be wanting to give the thing away at less than market value. So there's a lot of work going on to try and work out this question of can you discount? If you can, how do you account for it? And frankly, we haven't found an answer to that, but there'll be stuff coming out soon, and there are officials in the Scottish Government who are wrestling with this, who could help if they're, you know, if these are considerations, as I know they will be in local authorities. As money gets tighter, then you know you're less inclined to let things go for under market value. On the other hand, we've got local authorities in Scotland who are giving away assets for £1 or whatever, partly because they're not assets, they're a liability. And one of the challenges at the minute for communities in Scotland is not to accept liabilities. You know, and there's quite a lot of work having to be done about, you know, understanding what a community can reasonably do, but what they cannot reasonably do, and how do you structure the finances in a way that can make all of this work. It's not easy territory, this whole question of valuation and discounting, but people are wrestling with it.
Can I very quickly add about local government? Because in the Western Isles, 75% of the population, the Outer Hebrides, that's that chain of islands down in the northwest. 75% of the population now live in community-owned land, and over half the land in the Western Isles belongs to the communities. And there was a sea change in local government, and they ran a seminar, and over again, people like the Director of Development, Planning, literally stood up and they used the words, "We're listening to you, we're listening to you." And that represented a sea change. And things have got better.
Yeah. Thank you, folks. So I want to really quickly introduce you to 4 people. Each of these people is going to facilitate the small group discussions now. We're going to ask you, after you grab a coffee or a cup of tea, to self-select, and if there's a facilitator you like a look at, head off with him or her, do a small group discussion, which we're going to be on until lunchtime. So first of all, we have Liam Campbell. Liam, do you want to stand up there? Show yourself. Oh, Liam's will be facilitating a workshop in the Joe McQuaid room or the basement. Maureen Hetherington. Maureen will be facilitating a workshop up in the Stephen Connolly room. Laurie McCusker doesn't know where he's going, but he'll be in the Ronan Downey room, and then Eamon Dean at the back of the room here will be somewhere else, Carol Simpson room. So now's the time to grab a cuppa and then head off to a discussion, and we'll see you after. And after that, it's lunch. One of the things that I want to do now is a slight change from what's on the timetable. Is I think it makes sense if we were able to hear some of the conversation that took place in some of the small groups there. So I've asked each of the scribes from the small groups to feed back 3 key points. And after we have this, we're going to have an opportunity for any burning questions that people have from this morning to this morning's speakers. So, first of all, Gemma, can you give me the points back from your group?
There are liability issues, but partnerships can help reduce the risk here. What's the Northern Ireland experience? We need a mapping exercise of community assets and private assets. And the third point was, what do we do with the assets? We need, the alternative energy examples were very important to us, and we need to sustain ourselves in the community sector and earn money from our assets.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. Go. Jenna, you're next.
Thanks. So our 3 points, our first one would have been, we asked who's community, like who counts as community, and obviously in Northern Ireland there's a question of who really does own the land, same as in Scotland. And then with that, what would the community ownership look like in urban versus rural settings, and also in contexts where this idea of community is contested, like in Northern Ireland. The second point would have been, we were all really interested in this idea of private property rights being sort of subordinate to the idea of the higher good, the common good, and community ownership. And then thirdly, connected to that, we talked a little bit about the relationship between ownership and the responsibility that comes with it, but also the way that capacity for managing land and resources plays into that, and how that would have to do with the higher good. So whether the community or an organization or a private owner or the council, whatever it may be, whether they have the capacity to manage certain parts of the land, because they might not be the ideal owners for a particular plot. So basically that the practical aspect of community ownership is complicated.
Laura's been nominated to do this section, has he?
3 points we've identified, and thanks to everybody for their participation. First of all, obviously, the political will that has existed in recent years in Scotland, that supportive framework that's been established and has been important, has been very important, and we refer to things like, for instance, community energy, where Scotland has been the leading region, the leading country in terms of development of community energy initiatives, and again how that links in with land and the ownership of land. The second point was around the capacity and the supportive environment, and there was concerns and issues expressed around the capacity of some communities to actually embrace asset development, and the reference was made to the credit union movement and what a wonderful successful movement we have on this island and Northern Ireland on the credit union movement, and lessons to be learned there from the capacity building and supportive framework that the movement gives to its members, and an opportunity there for looking at that facilitative supportive environment around asset development. And thirdly, what we've picked out as a key point was it's not, the community is not in competition with the private sector. And one of the points made earlier this morning before the breakout sessions is it's very important for partnership working to consider and engage with the private sector. It shouldn't be us and them, it should be us altogether. So, we need to increasingly look at examples for the private sector be actively engaged with the community and with government.
on. Thank you, Laurie. Some really interesting points. Roisin, stop writing now. It's too late.
Okay, so our main points were, some of them are a wee bit similar to some of the stuff that's already been said. Gaps around awareness of just the whole realm of land ownership and asset transfer, and understanding the principle of it, and the need for capacity building within the community, that maybe this is something that needs to be addressed. There's funding for community projects, but sometimes there's a lack of funding for actual infrastructure projects. We also talked about the legislation in Scotland, and it's amazing what we've seen from this morning, what actually can be done when the legislation is in place. We also pointed out about the lack of knowledge around the land locally here and who owns it. So maybe there's a need for some sort of audit or record to be done to actually record who owns land and how do we get it. We also talked about the need for partnership working, and there needs to be a partnership, sort of an ongoing relationship through the whole process. So even once the asset is transferred, did you have to continue to share the risk? We also spoke quite a bit about community and what that means and the whole definition of community. And we talked a bit about how that might change as you start the process of land ownership and asset transfer. So it might be a community of interest, then it might change to a community of place, and that this will change through the process. We also talked a bit about how, once you've decided on what you want to do, about getting the backing of the majority of your community towards your proposal, and that's important, because if you don't have that, then it's going to be very, very difficult to move on. And a lot of this and all the stuff we're talking about this morning depends on, I suppose, the community and the state of local government. You know, was there risk averseness there? Is there a lack of belief from the government that the community can actually do it?
Thank you, Roisin. And thanks to everybody. So I think we've space for a few questions. I know the speakers from this morning are willing to answer them. Have a look. Has there anybody anything that they'd like to ask that they mightn't have had a chance to do just yet?
What role does the devolved community planning have in relation to community asset transfer?
Do you want to take that one?
Can I ask a related question? Just kind of examples of community asset transfer in Northern Ireland.
I don't know if these guys on those.
You know, somebody in the room might know.
When you talk about community planning, do you talk about that as a formal statutory process, as we have in Scotland?
Yes, we now have.
So bringing together the health authorities, police, local authorities,
There's some
and the third sector. And so
some
on.
of the responsibility has been devolved, some has not. But in the context of what has been devolved, what role does the community planning statutory obligation have in community asset transfer?
Actually, it's a good question. I actually don't really know the answer to that. My sense is that not a lot, other than in the agencies in any particular local authority area, if that's the unit of organisation, you know, sharing with each other how do they do asset transfer, how do they prioritise it, what do they do about things like discounts, you know, and all that practical stuff. So I imagine some of those conversations take place, but it's not driving what's happening, but it would be complementary to what's happening.
Thank you.
Can I just add a very small bit? I don't know if it's quite relevant to planning, but just in the Western Isles we are further forward in planning. Now in our own area in Harris, led by the two community landowning trusts, we've sat down round the table and invited other people in, your community councils, your voluntary sector. But we've pushed for it, and we've produced a plan that is the socio-economic community report, our Harris plan, and it's ours. It belongs to the community. It doesn't belong to any of the agencies. The agencies facilitated and said go for it. And we produced this document that is, it shows what each organisation wants to do. It shows who the lead partner is, who they need support from, and the time frame. And we've taken that and we're putting it on the desks of the council, obviously, the planners, the Council Economic Development, the housing associations, Scottish National Heritage, anybody who's mentioned as a partner. A copy of this has been approved by the whole community, and it's landing on the desks of these people who make decisions. And to me, I'm chuffed because I think it's the key between the disconnect between these groups and the person on the ground. And after the lead organisations in Harris put this together, there were copies throughout the island,
and any individual could come in and make comment and add bits to it. Because keep coming back, the way to make things happen in my mind is a bottom-up approach. And the planners know what's in all our minds for the next 5 years till 2020. And woe betide them if they don't take that on board.
Fiona, if you want to comment about the Northern Ireland, then you for a question.
I think there probably have been lots of examples of community asset transfer over the years, maybe just happening underneath the radar. I know that the Northern Ireland Housing Executive had been handing over in lease arrangements assets, you know, like community houses and pieces of land and so on for community use for many years. But since the community asset transfer policy was launched in May 2014, Development Trusts and I have been engaged in a demonstration programme along with the DSD, Department for Communities. And we have had some positive examples of community asset transfer. Now, obviously, it's not without its challenges for all the reasons that has been described. And I mean, Scotland has been at this much longer than us, and they're still encountering some of the same difficulties in terms of, you know, how the discounts, for example, could be applied and trying to quantify social return and so on. But we have had a couple of positive examples. We had one there recently in Lower North Belfast where the Department for Regional Development handed over completely, really, there was no money changed hands there. It's just a verge on the side of the road, but the community wanted to make a memorial garden out of it. So it has been done and it can be done. And we had another situation there in Brisbane, where Brisbane District Community Development Association, a very long-standing organisation and very competent organisation, actually took over the police station, which was redundant there. And they did pay the market value for it. But at the same time, that was a closed sale, so it didn't go out to market. You know, so there are ways of doing it. We're working with a number of other organisations. Garva Development Trust, there's quite a bit of land up there in Garva with the high school, which is no longer occupied. And there's a very, very animated community group have come together specifically to look at the potential for the community to own that very large site. And there's an asset on it that is actually listed. So we're working our way through the difficulties. And I suppose we'll have to continue to do that, and we'll have to continue to face the challenges as they come up.
I asked a question to two lads from Scotland about, you were talking about the political will being so important. Do all of the political parties in Scotland agree with this process and support this process, or just some of them, or is there consensus?
Yeah, just before I come to that, I'll just pick up the point David was making about planning. That one of the things that there's been a planning review, and that's like the Town and Country Planning Act approach to planning, development control and local spatial planning has been underway, and we gave evidence to that. But I gather that one of the things they are saying is that planning needs to start from the bottom, David's point, up. And we've been pushing, and DTAS, the Development Trust Association in Scotland, have been pushing, and others have been pushing for local visioning exercises of a place. And if you can do that adequately, describe how you want your place to be, not just in 5 years, but in 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, that's difficult to do. But it's in that context that you can work out what are your land needs, and therefore how do you then think about going about gaining the assets that you require to deliver that vision. And it looks like that's going to take more force. We've had one of our members who did one of those exercises on a small island which was owned by SNH, Scottish Natural Heritage, and they did a visioning of where they needed housing in the future and all that kind of stuff, and did it properly, very participative, and the local authorities now adopted that plan as an exception to their local formal statutory local plan. So we think there's a route into doing all that. It's not community planning per se, but it's a different point. On the political consensus, if you look back from the first Parliament in Scotland, in 1999, that was a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition, and they put through the first Land Reform Act. The movement towards where we've got to now started in the Rural Affairs Committee of Parliament, and there was cross-party consensus to do a review of that Land Reform Act and see what needed to change to drive things further forward, and that was done on a cross-party basis. The Conservatives are much more nervous about this than others, for perhaps understandable reasons. But nonetheless, it was done on a cross-party basis. the most recent legislation, the Community Empowerment Act and the recent Land Reform Act, you've got an SNP government. One was a majority government, they're now in a minority administration. But the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens all totally supported what was happening. And again, the Conservatives were nervous on bits of it. They don't like the compulsory sale stuff. They just don't want to go there. It should only be by willing sellers, as they would have it. But nonetheless, they were right behind the stuff on transparency of ownership, for example. And they're not at all against community ownership, if it's voluntary in their terms. So yes, you have got a broad parliamentary consensus, and there's been a window of opportunity because of that we've been able to exploit. How long that'll last? Don't know.
Any last questions? Dennis?
Yeah. If the various authorities, whether they're local or central government, are the executive arm of the community, surely they should be facilitating groups at any level to acquire land if necessary or to make the land available. Is this pertinent in Scotland?
Well, I mean, I guess that where we're at statutorily is that they know they've got to do it now. Under the Community Empowerment Act, they're under statutory obligation. If a community asks for the transfer of an asset, whether it's a forest or other land owned by the local authority or whatever, the local authority is under a statutory duty to consider that and not to what's the word I'm looking for? But not to unreasonably withhold permission to transfer, either by lease or by ownership. So that's driving their behaviours, and they're forming policies of asset transfer now required. Everybody in government's got to have an asset transfer policy. Local authorities are doing the same. So they are facilitating it, not necessarily. Some do it willingly, but they're now having to do it because the power is in the community's hands. There's another part I didn't tell you about at all today, which is that the Community Empowerment Act has also got what they call a right of participation. So if you're receiving a public service in your community and you don't like the way it's being delivered, you can make what's called a participation request, which means that you're formally asking the local authority to enter into dialogue with you about how that service is delivered to your community, and through that dialogue to identify better ways of delivering it. Now that might be better ways the local authority itself does, or the health board, but it could equally be transferring some of the responsibility to the community itself to deliver. So that's trying to create a dynamic which empowers the community to have a conversation with the statutory authorities about how they receive their services. And in many ways that could be as powerful as the asset transfer business, but it's not about assets per se, it's about service delivery.
Thank you. I think that's about all the time we have for questions. So if I could ask Ian and Liam, maybe